Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's short introduction to the Second World War, this one from his chapter 17 on the murder of the European Jews. This is the final section of the chapter. Incidentally, let me apologize in advance if there's traffic noise. Normally I record these videos at the weekend when there's less traffic, but we had a major power cut, so this is one of the weekday videos. So Parker ends this chapter by asking whether there was a wider responsibility for the murder of so many millions of European Jews. Some historians, he writes, have attacked what they have described as the abandonment of Europe's Jews by the British and the Americans. There's no doubt that the reluctance of the United States and the British Empire countries to accept more refugees from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland during the 1930s ultimately contributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of people. But at the time, the governments of these countries had no reason to suppose that the Nazis would ultimately embark on mass murder. They thought that their refusal to accept would-be refugees would at worst only lead to their persecution, but not to their deaths. Incidentally, German racial fanaticism also served to discredit the genteel pre-war anti-Semitism that had existed in both Britain and the USA. The final solution only began in the second half of 1941 and became known in Britain and the USA in the summer of 1942, but by then rescue projects were really only illusions. The only way they could think of to end German atrocities was by bringing the war to a victorious end as quickly as possible. They publicly proclaimed what was then known about the attacks on the Jews in December 1942, but for most of the British and American publics, the bloodbaths of Eastern Europe were distant horrors. They were not indifferent, but they had been brutalized by the war and concentrated on the hazards and deaths that were of personal relevance to them. The British and American governments chose to reject the Nazi practice of identifying the Jews as a separate race, separate from the wider society. But in so doing, they also obscured the racial basis of the Nazi genocide and its deliberate targeting of Jews as an imagined racial group, and also similarly of the Gypsies. A number of offers were made from the Axis side. At the end of 1942, Marshal Antonescu, the Romanian chief minister, proposed allowing up to 80,000 Jews to emigrate to Palestine in exchange for a substantial payment per head. The British and the Americans then each argued that the other take more refugees. The British insisted that Britain was already short of food and accommodation, and, less plausibly, that the empire was already overcrowded. Their chief fear was that the Americans would insist upon the refugee Jews being settled in British-controlled Palestine, thus provoking further Arab violence and threatening Britain's influence in the Arab world. For their part, the Americans dreaded a hostile reaction in Congress to any threat to American immigration laws. Both, especially the British, feared that Hitler and his allies were simply engaging in a form of blackmail, saying to the West, either take these people off our hands or we will kill them, a threat which could then be extended to millions of other people as potential victims. Unable to think of an adequate response, the British and Americans contented themselves with stating in the spring of 1943 that, correctly, there was no adequate shipping for such a project. Fortunately, this prevarication didn't lead to any extra deaths, as the Romanians had by then already decided to stop the deportations. Then, in 1944, Admiral Horthy in Hungary offered to allow the emigration of 7,800 Jews, whilst Joel Brand, a member of the Jewish Budapest Aid and Rescue Committee involved in protecting Jews, became an appointed intermediary between Adolf Eichmann, one of the major organizers of the final solution, to both the Allies and the Jews in Palestine, with a plan to release 1 million Jews in exchange for material support for the German war with the Soviet Union. Seeing this as an obvious attempt to split the alliance between the Western Allies and the USSR, the British scotched the plan and quickly informed the Soviets, lest they thought that there was a secret deal with the Germans behind their backs. As the deportations of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz had already begun, the sincerity of Eichmann's offer at this point can be doubted. In general, almost anything which the British and the Americans could have done, apart from making a successful invasion of France in 1943, would have had only a marginal effect on the situation of the European Jews, although even a marginal saving of life would have been worthwhile. The only exception to this generalization would have been if they had given neutral nations more encouragement to take in refugees with the guarantee that if they did so, this wouldn't mean they would have responsibility for their permanent accommodation. Such neutral nations, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and Turkey, would also have to feel safe from German invasion. Even this would have had only a small effect, however, as it only became clear that the Allies would win the war by late 1943, by which time most of the Jewish victims were already dead. Nevertheless, some small savings of life were achieved in the later years of the war, when the British and Americans succeeded in persuading the neutral countries to relax their frontier controls. An inter-Allied pledge to help Jewish refugees return to their countries of origin after the end of the war was prevented by the inability of the Soviet and Polish governments to agree on their post-war border. The most important missed opportunity now appears to have been the Anglo-American failure to bomb the Auschwitz killing center, not just the railways leading to it. This could have saved large numbers of lives, and by the summer of 1944, the 15th US Air Force, based in Italy, was within operational range. Of course, the chances of success were unknown, and the Germans could well have substituted other methods of mass killings in other locations. The decision would also have required approval at the highest level, but both Churchill and Roosevelt had delegated such decisions to others, Churchill to his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden, and his subordinates, Roosevelt to a War Refugee Board, but in neither case was the matter pursued. The authorities involved were not indifferent, but merely preoccupied with their own priorities. Their imagination was blinkered by their concern with the wider course of events. In retrospect, the fate of the European Jews has irrevocably eroded human self-esteem and self-confidence. Nazi murderers were able to successfully perpetuate these crimes. They used terror, fraud, bribery, and an appeal to anti-Semitism to gain the cooperation or connivance of large sections of varied European societies. And whilst few would have grasped the full savagery of Nazi actions, it was obvious that at best the deportations meant ruined lives and broken homes, and at worst speedy enslavement and speedy death. The Nazis exposed a wider human evasiveness, cowardice, and selfishness. Many Germans still retain a sense of guilt that it was their society that gave power to the Nazis, but other West Europeans, including the British, know that their relative freedom from guilt rests on historical accident, not moral superiority. Only a small number of individuals at the time showed heroism, and few nations can feel reassured of the moral worth of their individual members. So many thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement. Without them, I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel if you so wish. Please do like, comment and share on the videos. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. I'll give Patreon and PayPal links below in case you want to provide practical support. Next week we'll move on to the final chapter in Parker's book on the impact of the war. This is the first section of that, dealing with war deaths. Have a good day.